Why does it seem like the public is, at this point, being purposely misled or being treated like we have the intelligence of a 5-year-old? It is truly mind-boggling. It is mind-boggling for me, 1, for Charlie's family, 2, for the honor of Charlie, and 3, for the fact that we are a nation who understands guns very well. Now, like I've said before, I'm going to do an entire breakdown of everything involved with it. But we've all been looking for the answers as far as, was this an exit wound? If it was, where is the entry? Who actually shot him? Was the guy on the roof actually the guy? If he was, why was he running off the roof with no apparent gun in his hand? Oh, he took it apart, because that makes sense when you're trying to get away from a murder scene. You're going to sit there on the roof and take your gun apart just so you can put it in your backpack, and then you're going to reassemble it and dump it in the woods just so whenever they find it, it looks picture perfect for them.
What if everything we've been told about Charlie Kirk's shooting is wrong? What if the details we have accepted as fact, the narrative we have been fed for months, are not just incomplete, but entirely misleading? Imagine the countless articles, social media posts, and news segments, all confidently stating the same version of events, all pointing to a straightforward story. Charlie Kirk was shot in a manner that seemed clear and unambiguous. 4 months, that story went uncontested. A single bullet, an exit wound, fired from the front. That was the line, the framing, the truth everyone circulated. Yet, as new evidence comes to light, that simple story begins to unravel, revealing cracks in the narrative that could completely rewrite what happened that night. This is not speculation in the casual sense. This is not idle conspiracy theory or rumor mill chatter. We are dealing with a real case involving real people, real consequences, and a shooting that came terrifyingly close to claiming a life. Every detail matters. Every report, every witness statement, every medical record and forensic analysis carries weight. When something as fundamental as the direction of the gunshot comes into question, it isn't just a technicality, it is a pivot around which the entire investigation can turn. Because if the wound we've all been told was an exit wound is, in fact, an entry wound, then everything we thought we knew about what happened, how it happened, and who might have been involved could be fundamentally wrong. It's essential to understand that our goal here is not to sensationalize tragedy or to exploit fear. This isn't about clicks or viral headlines. This is about clarity. About asking the questions others are hesitant to ask. About following the evidence wherever it leads, even if it contradicts the narrative that has been widely accepted. In examining Charlie Kirk's shooting, we have to strip away preconceptions and assumptions. We must look at the incident through a lens sharpened by critical inquiry. Because history, especially recent history, is littered with instances where the initial story, often the first story, turned out to be incomplete, misleading, or entirely false. Some of the claims we are exploring today are based on newly surfaced evidence. This evidence is compelling, and it forces us to re-examine the sequence of events, but it is not yet fully verified by law enforcement or forensic authorities. That is an important distinction. Nothing presented here is intended to accuse or to assign guilt. Our aim is to raise questions, highlight inconsistencies, and consider alternative possibilities that could drastically alter the understanding of the shooting. By doing so, we hope to shed light on the reality of the situation, rather than allowing a possibly flawed narrative to solidify unchallenged in the public consciousness. Consider the most basic of these questions. What if Charlie Kirk was shot from behind? For months, the dominant narrative suggested a frontal attack, a bullet entering from the front and exiting the other side. But emerging reports, coupled with new visual evidence, witness accounts, and medical records, hint at a far more complex scenario. If the bullet actually entered from the back, the implications are enormous. It could suggest that Charlie Kirk was fleeing or unaware of his assailant at the time, that the position of the shooter was different than previously reported, or even that multiple shooters were involved. A single detail, seemingly minor to an outsider, could entirely reshape the investigation and the public's understanding of the event. Medical and ER reports are critical in this context. Forensic pathologists and emergency room physicians document gunshot wounds meticulously, entry and exit points, bullet trajectory, impact angle, and tissue damage all provide essential clues. Yet, in the initial reports shared publicly, certain ambiguities were either overlooked or misinterpreted. In chaotic, life-threatening situations, errors and misreporting can occur, especially when details are filtered through multiple layers: police statements, hospital summaries, and media reporting. What the ER report might have originally documented in clinical, technical language could have been simplified or miscommunicated in the rush to share news. And if the wound has been mischaracterized, even subtly, it alters not just the medical understanding but the investigative direction, the reconstruction of events, and the eventual public perception. Let's pause and consider what this really means. An entry wound versus an exit wound is not a semantic debate. It fundamentally determines the trajectory of the bullet, the position of the shooter, and the circumstances surrounding the shooting. If the wound was indeed an entry wound, it may mean that Charlie Kirk was shot from behind while walking or running, completely unaware of the immediate danger. That small, easily overlooked detail reframes the story from a simple confrontation to a potentially more sinister scenario. The way law enforcement approaches suspects, the questions investigators ask witnesses, and the evidence they prioritize could all change if this detail is true. Moreover, the psychological implications are profound. For the public, for family, for friends, how we perceive events influences both emotional responses and judgments. When a narrative is simplified incorrectly, it doesn't just distort facts, it shapes collective memory and understanding. Charlie Kirk's experience, reduced to a neat, digestible story, might erase vital context, the fear, the confusion, and the real danger that was present. And for investigators, acknowledging that the initial understanding may be flawed is not a weakness, it is a necessary step toward truth. It is a reminder that no matter how confident we feel about a version of events, evidence must always lead, and assumptions must always be tested. We also have to consider the broader implications for accountability. If the initial story was misleading, intentionally or otherwise, who benefits from that narrative? And who suffers when the truth is obscured? When the trajectory of the bullet is misrepresented, whether by error or miscommunication, it has cascading effects. Witness statements may be misinterpreted, suspect movements misaligned, and the public's understanding of the threat misinformed. Every investigation relies on a chain of evidence, and even a single mischaracterized wound can disrupt that chain, delaying justice or leading to erroneous conclusions. Finally, reflecting on this, the situation underscores an essential principle in analyzing violent incidents. Skepticism and critical thinking are vital. Accepting a story at face value, especially one repeated endlessly across media channels, can obscure truth rather than reveal it. In Charlie Kirk's case, the emerging evidence challenges a core element of the accepted narrative. That challenge should not be dismissed or ignored. It should be examined, scrutinized, and pursued until clarity is achieved. The stakes are too high, the consequences too real, to settle for convenient simplifications. Because when a life is involved, when a community is shaken, and when trust in official narratives is at stake, the pursuit of truth is not optional, it is imperative. The original narrative was presented as straightforward, almost tidy in its simplicity. Frontal shot. Exit wound. Quick investigation. Headlines across major media outlets echoed the same version, each reinforcing the idea that the case had been rapidly assessed, analyzed, and resolved. The public was fed a story that appeared clear-cut. The shot came from the front, the trajectory was obvious, and the events unfolded in a manner that required little further scrutiny. For many, the narrative satisfied the need for immediate comprehension, giving the impression that law enforcement and medical professionals had fully understood the circumstances surrounding Charlie Kirk's shooting. It was a narrative packaged neatly, with all the key elements seemingly aligned: crime scene, suspect positioning, and ballistic evidence presented in a way that left little room for doubt or alternative interpretations. Headlines celebrated the efficiency of the investigation, framing the incident as a single, identifiable event with a comprehensible cause, rather than a complex situation with multiple variables that warranted deeper analysis. Law enforcement initially described the incident as a targeted political attack, framing it as a deliberate, calculated act directed at Charlie Kirk. The official narrative emphasized motive, positioning the event within a broader context that suggested premeditation rather than random misfortune. In this version of events, the shot from the front aligned perfectly with the idea of an assailant confronting the target head-on. It painted a picture that was easy to understand, with the expected arc of aggression, confrontation, and injury fitting neatly into the story of a politically motivated attack. Yet, even as the narrative was reinforced in public statements, the medical details remained sparse, with reports offering only the most basic descriptions of the wound. The lack of detailed documentation, imaging, or precise trajectory analysis left significant gaps in the record, gaps that would later become critical as new evidence emerged. For the public, this absence of technical information was largely invisible. The story seemed coherent, the explanation sufficient, and the complexity beneath the surface largely ignored. Surveillance footage at the scene was similarly limited, providing only partial coverage of the events as they unfolded. Critical angles, particularly those behind Charlie Kirk, were obstructed, missing, or simply never captured. These blind spots left investigators and the public relying heavily on initial witness statements, which themselves were often inconsistent or dismissed outright. Alternative theories were quietly set aside, regarded as unlikely or speculative rather than actively investigated. In many cases, statements that contradicted the frontal shot narrative were labeled as confusion, misperception, or error. The effect was to reinforce a singular perspective. The shooter was positioned in front, the wound was an exit, and the investigation confirmed what had already been assumed. Other possibilities, including the notion that the trajectory might be entirely different, were never given serious consideration. Over time, this framing solidified in the public consciousness, creating an enduring belief in a version of events that was simple, coherent, and seemingly definitive. At the time, the scenario appeared straightforward, almost deceptively so. The narrative was clear, the motive was understandable, and the physical evidence, at least as presented, appeared to support the conclusions being drawn. But the simplicity of the story may have obscured more than it revealed. What if investigators, constrained by time, procedural pressures, or the desire to provide the public with answers, were mistaken? What if the very detail that seemed most certain, the exit wound, was in fact misidentified? This is not a minor point. The distinction between an entry wound and an exit wound is central to understanding ballistic trajectory, shooter positioning, and the sequence of events. Misidentification can redirect investigative focus, exclude potential suspects, and create a chain of assumptions that ultimately misrepresents the reality of the incident. If the exit wound was never an exit wound at all, then the foundational understanding of the shooting is upended. The trajectory, previously assumed to be forward, would need to be reconsidered entirely. This shift has cascading implications. The position of the shooter, the potential angles of approach, and even the interpretation of witness statements all change dramatically. Every subsequent analysis, diagram, and reconstruction built on the frontal shot assumption would require re-evaluation. Questions that were previously thought to be answered, such as the identity of the assailant, the nature of the confrontation, and the plausibility of the motive, suddenly become open once more. A single mischaracterized wound, one that may have seemed minor at first glance, has the power to reshape the investigation, rewrite the timeline, and challenge the very narrative presented to the public. The apparent certainty of the original narrative now appears fragile in retrospect. The story that seemed settled, shot from the front, exit wound confirmed, motive clear, is suddenly rife with ambiguity. Every element that seemed straightforward, every assumption that seemed unquestionable, must be reconsidered in light of the possibility that the injury itself was misunderstood. And if the wound is indeed not an exit wound, it raises even deeper concerns. How many other details were assumed rather than verified? How many witnesses were dismissed prematurely? How many investigative leads were left unexplored? Each unanswered question compounds the uncertainty, revealing a case far more complex than the initial headlines suggested. The realization that the exit wound might never have existed is more than a technicality, it is a pivot point, a lens through which the entire incident must be re-examined. It forces investigators, analysts, and the public to question the reliability of the official account and to consider alternative scenarios that had been previously overlooked or dismissed. It invites scrutiny of the initial forensic assessments, the interpretations of medical personnel, and the framing of law enforcement statements. Most importantly, it underscores that what was presented as a simple, self-contained story may, in fact, be only the surface of a far more complicated reality, one in which the true trajectory of the bullet, the positioning of the shooter, and the sequence of events are far less certain than the public was led to believe. In the end, the question remains: if the exit wound was misidentified, what does that mean for the entire investigation? How does it change our understanding of what happened to Charlie Kirk? And perhaps most critically, why was the narrative allowed to solidify before these fundamental questions could be fully addressed? The answers may hold the key to understanding not only the mechanics of the shooting itself but also the broader truth behind one of the most closely watched incidents of recent times. New forensic evidence is painting a picture that challenges everything previously assumed about the shooting. Medical examinations, previously summarized in broad strokes, are now revealing details that were either overlooked or misinterpreted. The wound itself, once reported as an exit, now exhibits characteristics that strongly suggest a posterior entry, a shot fired from behind rather than from the front. This is not conjecture, it is grounded in precise, clinical observation and analysis. The wound displays clean edges, symmetrical tissue disruption, minimal tearing, and an absence of fragmentation typically associated with bullets exiting the body. Each of these indicators in isolation might seem trivial, but collectively, they point decisively toward a trajectory entirely opposite to what the public was told. A former trauma surgeon who reviewed images and reports of the injury commented, "The tissue around the penetration point is too neat, too intact to be an exit." The statement is stark but clear. The wound's characteristics align more closely with an entry point than an exit. Ballistics experts who have examined the available information further reinforce this troubling possibility. Analysis of the bullet's path, angles, and force vectors indicates a trajectory moving upward from behind, rather than forward as originally reported. This trajectory suggests not only a different point of origin for the shot but also an entirely different set of circumstances surrounding the incident. The positioning of the shooter, the victim's stance or movement, and the timing of the discharge all come into question. If the bullet came from behind, then the narrative of a frontal confrontation becomes implausible, and investigators must reconsider every piece of evidence that hinged on that assumption. Every witness statement, every surveillance clip, every initial assumption about the event's dynamics may require re-examination in light of this new information. Yet, what is even more alarming is the lack of corroborating physical evidence at the supposed point of origin. No casing was recovered at the front, no impact marks on surfaces indicated a frontal discharge, and surveillance footage covering the rear of the scene was either sparse or entirely absent at critical moments. This combination of missing evidence and overlooked details raises serious questions about the thoroughness of the initial investigation. How could such discrepancies have gone unnoticed or unaddressed? Why were reports from witnesses claiming they heard shots from behind seemingly dismissed or ignored? How did camera angles that might have captured the shooter's position end up blocked, obscured, or unavailable? These gaps in both the investigative record and public understanding suggest more than mere oversight. They hint at significant investigative blind spots that demand explanation. The implications of recognizing the wound as a posterior entry are profound. This is not a minor correction or a trivial detail. It strikes at the very foundation of the accepted narrative. A rear entry wound shifts the potential location of the shooter entirely, forcing a re-evaluation of every timeline, every movement, and every assumption about the confrontation. Suspects who were previously considered peripheral or irrelevant may now come under renewed scrutiny. Motives that seemed implausible in the context of a frontal attack suddenly gain weight when viewed through the lens of a shot from behind. Even broader questions emerge. Could there have been multiple shooters? Could critical information have been suppressed, whether intentionally or through procedural oversight? The ramifications extend beyond the immediate investigation, touching on law enforcement credibility, media reporting, and public trust in the unfolding of justice. Medical forensic experts emphasize that the distinction between entry and exit wounds is far from academic. Entry wounds generally indicate the starting point of a projectile, providing critical information about distance, angle, and position. Exit wounds, conversely, reflect where the bullet leaves the body, often creating more chaotic tissue disruption, irregular edges, and sometimes even fragmentation within the body. Misidentifying these wounds can dramatically alter ballistic reconstructions, crime scene analyses, and subsequent investigative decisions. In Charlie Kirk's case, the initial mischaracterization, or potentially premature conclusion about the nature of the wound could have misdirected law enforcement, misinformed the media, and shaped public perception in ways that obscured the reality of the attack. What was assumed to be a frontal attack was, in all likelihood, a rear assault, and this fundamental misreading reshapes the event from start to finish. The question arises, why wasn't this examined thoroughly from the beginning? Why were potential inconsistencies treated as anomalies rather than signals demanding deeper scrutiny? Witness accounts that pointed toward shots from behind were often downplayed, disregarded, or deemed unreliable. Critical camera angles that could have documented the scene and clarified shooter positioning were inexplicably unavailable or obstructed. Each of these gaps in evidence collection raises troubling possibilities. It is plausible that procedural errors occurred under the pressure of a high-profile investigation. It is also plausible, though far more concerning, that certain lines of inquiry were intentionally minimized or overlooked, whether due to oversight, bias, or other factors. Regardless of cause, the absence of rigorous investigation into these key elements left the initial narrative unchallenged, creating a version of events that may have been far removed from reality. Understanding this, the emergence of new forensic evidence becomes even more critical. The medical and ballistic indicators suggesting a posterior entry require law enforcement and investigators to reconsider the trajectory, positioning, and potentially even the sequence of events leading up to the shooting. Every aspect of the case, suspect identification, timeline reconstruction, and motive evaluation, may shift in response to this realization. Investigators now face the difficult task of reconciling previous assumptions with evidence that may point to an entirely different scenario. This is not merely a technical correction. It has the potential to reshape the narrative of the shooting entirely, influencing legal strategies, media coverage, and public perception. The ramifications extend beyond logistics and timelines. For Charlie Kirk's family, friends, and supporters, the distinction between a frontal attack and a rear assault carries profound emotional weight. The idea of being struck from behind conjures different perceptions of danger, vulnerability, and intent. It introduces questions about situational awareness, potential ambush, and premeditation. It also raises concerns about accountability and whether all possible suspects and motives have been thoroughly investigated. These are not theoretical musings. They are essential considerations in understanding both the event itself and its broader societal impact. Ultimately, this is a moment that underscores the importance of critical scrutiny in high-stakes investigations. The emergence of evidence suggesting a posterior entry wound is not a minor update or a detail to be glossed over. It is a pivotal revelation that demands attention, re-evaluation, and transparency. Until these questions are fully addressed, the accepted narrative of Charlie Kirk's shooting remains incomplete, potentially misleading, and fraught with unanswered questions. If the wound truly represents a shot from behind, the entire story, the who, the how, and the why, may require fundamental reconsideration, opening the door to new suspects, new motives, and a far deeper understanding of what actually transpired that day. There were multiple witnesses who reported hearing shots coming from behind, a detail that directly contradicts the original narrative of a frontal attack. Yet, these accounts were largely sidelined, dismissed as unreliable, or ignored in official statements. The public narrative focused almost exclusively on a frontal trajectory, as if alternative perspectives simply did not exist. Adding to the mystery, surveillance footage covering the rear areas, where witnesses claimed the shots originated, was obstructed, incomplete, or entirely missing at critical moments. This absence is not a trivial gap. In modern investigations, surveillance cameras are often the most objective witnesses, capable of capturing movements, positions, and interactions that human memory alone may misremember. The lack of clear visual documentation for the rear corridors raises serious concerns about how thoroughly the scene was monitored and whether crucial evidence was overlooked, intentionally or otherwise. One attendee, speaking to investigators off the record, reported seeing a figure quickly leaving the rear service corridor immediately after the shots were fired. This fleeting observation, if corroborated, could provide a critical lead regarding the shooter's position and escape path. Yet, for reasons that remain unclear, this account was never officially reported, recorded, or integrated into the broader investigation. In a case of this magnitude, every credible observation matters, and the omission of such a potentially pivotal detail raises profound questions. Why was this witness's account ignored? Was it dismissed as improbable, or was it actively suppressed to preserve the simplicity of the initial narrative? The absence of acknowledgement transforms what could have been a crucial investigative lead into a shadowy blind spot, one that casts doubt over the thoroughness of the original inquiry. Compounding the issue, medical reports were heavily redacted before release. Details that could have clarified the wound path, the angle of penetration, and the nature of the injury were blacked out, leaving gaps in the official record. Forensic analysis relies on precise documentation. The trajectory of the bullet, the orientation of the body, and the condition of surrounding tissue all inform investigators about shooter position and intent. By withholding these details, the reports effectively prevented independent scrutiny and limited the ability of outside experts to analyze the scene objectively. While redaction is sometimes necessary for privacy or security reasons, in this instance it removed information critical to understanding the shooting itself. Each redacted line obscured not just medical specifics but the potential truth of what happened during those critical moments. These omissions collectively raise far more questions than they answer. If the original narrative of a frontal shot were accurate, why were these discrepancies ignored? Why were eyewitness reports of rear-originating shots dismissed rather than investigated? Why was footage from the rear service areas unavailable, and why were medical details withheld from scrutiny? The accumulation of missing information suggests more than mere procedural oversight. It points to gaps, inconsistencies, or perhaps even intentional obfuscation. Every investigative gap, every redacted report, and every disregarded witness account amplifies uncertainty, leaving the public and those seeking justice with a fragmented understanding of the events. The official story, as disseminated to the public, treated these inconsistencies as minor or irrelevant. In press briefings and public statements, law enforcement maintained that the frontal attack narrative was definitive, without addressing the reports from witnesses who had seen or heard different events. The discrepancies between witness accounts, medical details, and surveillance gaps were brushed aside, leaving a narrative that appeared complete but was, in reality, incomplete. For those trying to reconcile what they saw, heard, or read, this presented an impossible contradiction. Official sources insisted on certainty, while the evidence quietly suggested ambiguity. The possibility that the scene itself may have been manipulated cannot be ignored. Who had access to the area behind Charlie during those critical minutes? Was there a deliberate effort to control what investigators could observe, or to prevent certain details from being recorded or preserved? Service corridors, back entrances, and restricted areas are often monitored in high security or public venues, yet in this case, they provide no definitive visual record. When gaps align suspiciously with emerging evidence that challenges the accepted story, questions of manipulation naturally arise. Was the scene tampered with, even unintentionally, to obscure the shooter's position? Was evidence removed, overlooked, or shielded from investigators who might have followed leads pointing to a rear attack? The implications of these questions are substantial. If the shooting did originate from behind, then the failure to document, report, or preserve evidence from that angle represents a critical lapse. It forces investigators and the public to reconsider not just the mechanics of the shooting but also the broader circumstances, the possibility of multiple actors, overlooked motives, or even deliberate interference. Who had the means, the access, and the opportunity to alter or obscure evidence at the scene? Each unanswered question compounds the uncertainty, creating a situation in which the official narrative no longer provides clarity but instead highlights the limits of what is known. Ultimately, these witness reports, surveillance gaps, and redacted medical details converge into a troubling pattern. Critical information that could illuminate the true dynamics of the shooting was either inaccessible, ignored, or suppressed. Every missing camera angle, every dismissed observation, every blacked-out medical notation is not a trivial detail. It is a point of potential insight lost. These lapses underscore the need for rigorous scrutiny, independent review, and an openness to revisiting assumptions that may have been prematurely accepted. Until these inconsistencies are addressed, the public and investigators themselves cannot fully understand who was behind Charlie at those decisive moments, how the shooting unfolded, or what forces shaped the narrative that followed. The absence of answers in these key areas leaves a shadow over the official story, suggesting that the truth may be more complex, more disturbing, and far less straightforward than initially presented. Misidentified wounds have a long and troubling history of derailing investigations, sometimes with profound consequences. Consider the case of Medgar Evers, whose death became enmeshed in confusion due in large part to conflicting forensic interpretations of the bullet trajectory. Early reports suggested a straightforward angle of entry and exit, yet careful re-examination revealed inconsistencies that cast doubt on the original narrative. It took years of painstaking review, cross-referencing of ballistic evidence, and expert testimony to begin to untangle what really happened. Similarly, in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, trajectory confusion played a pivotal role in shaping public perception and influencing official conclusions. Initial interpretations of the shots, the angles, and the origin points were widely accepted at first, yet subsequent analysis exposed discrepancies that fueled decades of debate, speculation, and skepticism. These historical examples demonstrate how critical even small errors in wound identification can be, errors that ripple outward, affecting investigative focus, suspect identification, and public understanding alike. Now look at the case of Charlie Kirk. At first glance, the story seems simple. A bullet entered, traveled through, and exited, a straightforward, frontal wound. But what if that simplicity is misleading? What if a single misread wound, a mischaracterized entry versus exit, is shaping the entire narrative that has been presented to the public? The possibility that the wound may actually indicate a backward trajectory, from behind rather than in front, forces a complete reassessment of the incident. If the bullet traveled in the opposite direction from what was reported, it could dramatically alter the understanding of where the shooter was positioned, how the attack unfolded, and even the potential motives at play. A detail as small as the identification of a wound can be deceptively powerful, capable of reconfiguring the timeline of events and reshaping investigative priorities. For investigators, misidentifying a wound is not just a clinical error, it is a pivot point that influences everything that follows. The trajectory dictates the reconstruction of the scene, the framing of witness questions, and the direction of forensic analysis. If investigators assume the shot came from the front, they are guided towards suspects and scenarios that fit that presumption. Any evidence suggesting an alternative origin may be discounted, overlooked, or dismissed. This is precisely why understanding the correct trajectory is so critical. It is the thread that connects disparate pieces of the puzzle, from surveillance footage to eyewitness testimony, from bullet fragments to environmental markings at the scene. Without correctly interpreting that trajectory, the story that emerges can be fundamentally flawed, no matter how confident investigators or the public may feel about its accuracy. In Charlie Kirk's case, the emerging evidence suggesting a rearward trajectory is not just a minor correction. It could be the key to unlocking the real story. It compels a re-evaluation of every assumption, every reported observation, and every previously accepted detail. Witnesses who reported hearing shots from behind suddenly gain new significance. Obstructed or missing camera angles take on a heightened level of importance. Medical details that were redacted or simplified now demand full scrutiny. The potential implications extend far beyond the mechanics of a single gunshot. They touch on motive, access, timing, and perhaps even the possibility of multiple shooters. Every facet of the investigation may need to be revisited in light of this insight, because if the wound was misidentified, the chain of events we thought we understood could be fundamentally inverted. History offers a sobering lesson: bullets do not lie. Unlike eyewitnesses, memory, or even initial reports filtered through media and official statements, the trajectory of a bullet is a physical record, a traceable path that holds objective information. The angle of entry, the depth of penetration, and the resulting tissue damage all convey critical clues. But this story is only accessible if investigators, experts, and the public pay attention and interpret the evidence correctly. Misreading or overlooking these details allows narratives to solidify that may not reflect reality. In high-profile cases, such oversights are magnified. They influence public opinion, shape media coverage, and can even affect the course of justice. Applying this principle to Charlie Kirk, the backward trajectory suggested by new forensic analysis becomes a potential key to truth. It challenges the accepted story, highlights inconsistencies in witness accounts, and exposes gaps in surveillance and investigative follow-up. It raises pressing questions about how and why the original narrative was established and maintained, and whether assumptions were accepted too readily in the rush to provide clarity to a shaken public. Most importantly, it emphasizes the critical need to follow evidence rather than convenience, to let the physical facts of the shooting guide conclusions rather than preconceptions or pressure to resolve a high-profile case quickly. Ultimately, the lesson is clear: the path of a bullet tells a story, but only if we listen carefully, examine thoroughly, and interpret accurately. In the case of Charlie Kirk, the misidentification of a single wound may be far more consequential than anyone realized. It could redefine the shooter's location, reshape the sequence of events, and reveal a narrative far more complex than the initial reports suggested. The backward trajectory is not a minor detail. It is potentially the thread that unravels the oversimplified story that has been presented for months. And in following that thread, investigators, experts, and the public may finally begin to see the full, unsettling truth of what happened on that fateful day. It wasn't law enforcement that reopened the case. Months after the shooting, with official statements maintaining the original narrative, it became clear that the story wasn't being fully examined from all angles. Instead, it was independent analysts, determined citizen sleuths, and investigative journalists who began to dig deeper, driven by questions that authorities either could not or would not answer. These were individuals outside the traditional channels of investigation, people without official badges or authority, yet armed with curiosity, persistence, and access to fragments of information that had quietly circulated beneath the public radar. They scoured court filings, analyzed publicly available footage, reached out to witnesses, and compiled timelines that didn't quite align with the official story. Slowly, meticulously, they began to piece together a picture that challenged the initial assumptions. What they uncovered was startling. Leaked photos of the wound emerged, images previously unseen by the public and redacted in official releases. These photos provided a raw, unfiltered look at the injury, revealing details that had been obscured: the neat, symmetrical tissue around the entry point, the absence of fragmentation, and the upward angle of the trajectory. Unredacted ER notes, obtained through independent reporting and document requests, offered further insight, detailing what the medical staff had originally observed before edits and redactions sanitized the narrative. Cross-referencing these medical observations with the police diagrams and scene reconstructions exposed a troubling inconsistency. The official diagrams, often used to illustrate the frontal shot scenario, failed to align with the evidence from medical scans, imaging, and the wound photographs. Every detail that was inconsistent, no matter how minor it seemed, became a clue suggesting that the official account might be incomplete or inaccurate. These pieces did not emerge all at once. They surfaced gradually, scattered across blogs, forums, investigative newsletters, and quiet journalistic exposés. No single leak, photograph, or expert opinion could independently overturn the official narrative, but as the information accumulated, a clear pattern began to form. The more the data was analyzed, the more consistent the signals became. A backward trajectory, a clean entry wound, minimal tissue disruption, and indications that the bullet had traveled upward rather than forward. These elements collectively contradicted the long-accepted version of the incident and suggested a fundamentally different sequence of events. Each new piece of evidence built on the last, reinforcing the notion that what had been presented publicly might not tell the full story. Even small details, when taken together, became impossible to ignore. For instance, subtle inconsistencies in witness statements, previously dismissed as confusion, suddenly made sense in light of the wound trajectory. Observations that seemed contradictory under the frontal shot assumption aligned perfectly when interpreted as a shot from behind. The absence of casing at the supposed frontal point, previously chalked up to coincidence or procedural oversight, fit neatly into a scenario where the shooter's position had been elsewhere. These emerging patterns suggested that the official narrative was not merely incomplete, it was potentially misleading, painting a version of events that fit a neat, digestible storyline rather than the complex reality. The role of independent analysts and citizen investigators cannot be overstated. Without institutional oversight, these individuals were free to follow leads wherever they went, unencumbered by bureaucratic priorities, political sensitivities, or concerns about public image. Their methods combined traditional investigative techniques, interviews, document analysis, timeline reconstruction, with modern tools such as social media cross-referencing, geolocation verification, and crowdsourced scrutiny of public records. By approaching the case from multiple angles and synthesizing information from disparate sources, they began to construct a more nuanced understanding of the shooting than what had been publicly acknowledged. In doing so, they effectively forced a reconsideration of the official assumptions, challenging the notion that the case was as straightforward as initially presented. The pattern that emerged from this painstaking work is difficult to dismiss. The backward trajectory of the bullet, the clean, symmetrical entry wound, and the minimal tissue damage all converge to suggest a scenario that directly contradicts the frontal shot narrative. Each individual piece of evidence, one photograph, one expert assessment, one unredacted note, might not carry enough weight on its own to change minds. But the accumulation of these pieces, the repeated convergence of independent observations, creates a compelling picture that cannot be easily ignored. When viewed collectively, they tell a story that the official narrative has overlooked, one that suggests Charlie Kirk may have been attacked from behind, fundamentally reshaping the understanding of the incident. What is particularly striking is how slowly this picture emerged, far from the glare of mainstream headlines. While the public was consuming simplified reports and official statements, a quiet, meticulous reconstruction was underway behind the scenes. It demonstrates the power of patient, evidence-driven investigation and the importance of looking beyond surface-level narratives. The work of these independent analysts highlights how critical details, sometimes dismissed or hidden, can radically alter the understanding of events when examined thoroughly. Their diligence reveals that even in cases where authorities maintain a seemingly complete narrative, significant gaps and discrepancies may exist, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to question, investigate, and connect the dots. Ultimately, this emerging pattern, backward trajectory, clean entry, minimal tissue damage, is more than a technical observation. It is a challenge to the story that has been widely accepted for months. It underscores the necessity of vigilance, skepticism, and detailed scrutiny in the face of incomplete information. While official channels have not yet fully addressed these discrepancies, the collective work of independent investigators demonstrates that the truth is rarely as simple as it seems. Each leaked photo, each unredacted note, and each expert analysis adds a piece to a puzzle that, when assembled, reveals a narrative the public has been largely denied. In the case of Charlie Kirk, this painstaking reconstruction may hold the key to understanding not just how the shooting occurred, but why the story we've been told may have been so carefully curated, and why the full truth still remains just out of reach. If this wound is indeed an entry from behind, the implications are immediate and unsettling. It forces us to reconsider the very environment in which the shooting took place, the positions of everyone present, and the timeline of events that unfolded in those critical moments. The official narrative placed the assailant in front, creating a straightforward story, a direct line of attack, a frontal confrontation, a motive that seemed simple and comprehensible. But if the bullet came from behind, that narrative crumbles. Suddenly, the identities of those in proximity, their movements, and their access to critical areas take on an entirely different significance. Who was standing behind Charlie Kirk at the time? Who had the opportunity and the ability to position themselves there without drawing immediate attention? Every person who had access to the rear areas, service corridors, restricted entrances, or blind spots in surveillance becomes a potential point of interest, a detail that law enforcement and the public may not have fully appreciated. The question of why the public was told the shot came from the front is equally troubling. On one level, it could be explained by procedural assumptions or the limitations of initial observations. In the chaos of a shooting, early reports are often incomplete or inaccurate. Yet, the possibility of deliberate misdirection cannot be dismissed. Crafting a narrative that positions the shooter in front simplifies the story, making it easier to communicate, easier to process, and easier to contain in the public imagination. A frontal shot implies a direct, obvious confrontation, one that aligns with expectations of motive and aggressor behavior. A shot from behind, by contrast, complicates the story, introduces uncomfortable questions, and exposes investigative gaps. Controlling the narrative in this way may serve not only to reassure the public but also to shield inconvenient truths from scrutiny. The potential for a larger cover-up or deliberate misdirection becomes difficult to ignore. Consider the convergence of anomalies, missing or obstructed surveillance footage from the rear, dismissed witness reports of sounds and movements coming from behind, redacted medical records obscuring the precise nature of the wound, and diagrams that fail to match the evidence captured in photos and scans. Individually, these issues could be explained as procedural errors or coincidences. Taken together, they form a pattern suggestive of selective reporting and a narrative constructed to favor simplicity over accuracy. Whether intentional or not, the effect is the same. The public receives a story that may not reflect the full reality, and certain actors remain shielded from scrutiny. Every inconsistency in the official record invites a crucial question. Who benefits from keeping this narrative intact? In any high-profile investigation, there are always interests at play: political, institutional, reputational. Simplifying the trajectory of a bullet, framing the story as a straightforward frontal attack, and dismissing inconvenient observations can serve multiple purposes. It may protect key individuals from scrutiny, maintain public confidence, or preserve the perception of investigative competence. By controlling the narrative, those with influence over the investigation or its public presentation can steer attention away from uncomfortable possibilities and toward a version of events that appears complete and authoritative. Equally compelling is the question of who might be hiding in the shadows, hoping we never notice. A backward trajectory suggests the presence of someone positioned behind the victim at the precise moment of the shooting, a person whose movements, identity, and intentions remain largely unknown. This individual, whether acting alone or as part of a coordinated plan, holds critical information about the true nature of the attack. The obstruction of camera angles, the absence of clear visual evidence, and the selective dismissal of eyewitness accounts may indicate that this person, or persons, were intentionally shielded from observation. Their anonymity is preserved by gaps in documentation, procedural oversights, and the simplicity of the accepted narrative. The convergence of these elements, the misidentified wound, the dismissed witness accounts, and the obstructed surveillance, creates a scenario that demands scrutiny. It forces investigators, journalists, and the public to question assumptions, re-examine evidence, and consider possibilities that were previously dismissed as improbable. Each unanswered question compounds the uncertainty. Who was behind Charlie Kirk at that moment? Why was the wound mischaracterized? And to what extent has information been shaped to guide public perception? These questions are not merely academic. They strike at the heart of the investigation's integrity and the search for truth. Ultimately, the potential backward trajectory is more than a forensic observation. It is a lens through which the broader investigation must be reconsidered. It raises the possibility that the official story has obscured critical truths, that certain individuals may have exploited gaps in oversight, and that the narrative presented to the public was carefully curated, intentionally or otherwise. Every inconsistency becomes a clue, every omission a potential lead, and every unanswered question a reminder that the story may be far more complex and far more troubling than it has been portrayed. If we are to understand what truly happened, we must follow the evidence wherever it leads, scrutinize the inconsistencies that have been dismissed, and confront the uncomfortable possibility that someone, somewhere, is counting on us never to notice. The backward trajectory is not just a detail of the injury, it is a window into the unknown, a signal pointing toward hidden actors, concealed motives, and an unfolding story that has yet to be fully revealed. The more light we shine on this case, the more shadows seem to emerge. Every new piece of evidence, every witness account revisited, and every forensic analysis conducted outside the official channel seems to contradict the neat narrative that was presented to the public. The exit wound that we were repeatedly told defined the trajectory of the bullet may, in fact, never have existed. If so, it means the very foundation of the original investigation was built on an error, whether through oversight, assumption, or something more deliberate. This revelation forces the entire investigation to be reconsidered from the beginning, to revisit every decision, every report, every diagram, and every conclusion that followed. The scene, the timeline, and the sequence of events all must be reanalyzed with fresh eyes and without the biases introduced by an early, potentially flawed conclusion. If Charlie Kirk was shot from behind, the implications are profound. The identity of the shooter becomes a completely different question. Anyone previously ruled out due to assumptions about positioning might need to be reconsidered. The motive, long believed to align with the idea of a frontal confrontation, could be entirely different, perhaps pointing to intentions that were concealed, misinterpreted, or overlooked. The people involved in the events leading up to the shooting, the interactions, the access to restricted areas, and even those who may have been present but unnoticed take on new significance. Each new angle or detail invites us to rethink not just how the shooting occurred, but why, and under whose influence or control the narrative was shaped. Moreover, the case challenges us to confront broader questions about transparency, accountability, and the power of narratives in high-profile investigations. If the accepted story was incomplete or deliberately framed in a certain way, it underscores the importance of skepticism, independent analysis, and the willingness to question what is presented as fact. The backward trajectory of the bullet is not just a forensic detail, it is a catalyst that opens the door to a deeper investigation, one that must consider all evidence, all possibilities, and all discrepancies, no matter how uncomfortable they may be. The emerging pattern forces us to acknowledge that the truth may be far more complicated than the simple version presented initially. The case of Charlie Kirk, therefore, stands as a reminder that investigations are living processes, not static stories. Every misidentified wound, every redacted report, every dismissed witness adds layers of complexity that cannot be ignored. The backward trajectory, the clean entry wound, and the minimal tissue damage all point toward a scenario that has been largely ignored or suppressed in the public narrative. When pieced together, these elements suggest that the accepted story may be only a fraction of what really occurred, and that the full truth is still waiting to be uncovered by those willing to examine it critically and patiently. So, what is the real story behind Charlie Kirk's shooting? Was it a tragic accident, a miscalculated act in a chaotic moment, or is the truth being actively hidden, obscured by selective reporting, overlooked evidence, or deliberate misdirection? Every unanswered question, every inconsistency, and every anomaly demands scrutiny. The backward trajectory raises as many questions as it answers, prompting us to re-evaluate the official accounts, the evidence presented, and the assumptions that have guided public understanding for months. The implications are profound, touching not just on the mechanics of the shooting but also on accountability, transparency, and the very pursuit of justice. As this story continues to unfold, the role of independent analysts, journalists, and engaged citizens becomes crucial. By piecing together leaks, photographs, unredacted documents, and witness accounts, they are beginning to construct a more complete picture of what may have happened. Yet, much remains uncertain, and every discovery raises further questions, compelling us to dig deeper, to challenge assumptions, and to remain vigilant in our pursuit of the truth. The narrative is no longer fixed. It is evolving, shaped by emerging evidence and critical analysis, with each revelation carrying the potential to rewrite the story entirely. The investigation into Charlie Kirk's shooting is far from over. Every detail matters. The trajectory, the wound characteristics, the surveillance gaps, and the overlooked or ignored witness statements. Together, they form a mosaic of evidence that, when carefully examined, paints a more nuanced and possibly troubling picture than the one originally presented. The public deserves transparency and a full accounting of these findings, because until the inconsistencies are addressed and the questions answered, the official narrative remains incomplete. The shadows surrounding this case will only grow until the truth is brought fully to light. The story isn't finished. The evidence is speaking, slowly but insistently, revealing inconsistencies, gaps, and patterns that demand attention. And as the investigation continues, through independent analysis, forensic review, and renewed scrutiny, the answers may finally emerge. Every new insight challenges the narrative, every discrepancy sparks questions, and every reevaluation brings us closer to understanding the full truth of what happened to Charlie Kirk. The case remains open, the questions remain pressing, and the story is far from settled. Like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated. The investigation is ongoing, and as the evidence continues to unfold, those who pay attention will be the first to see the emerging truth.